There is a moment that often happens quietly in relationships with emotionally distant people. It doesn't involve an argument, it doesn't involve a dramatic goodbye. In fact, from the outside, it can look like nothing has changed at all. But internally, something shifts in a way that completely alters the emotional dynamic. That moment is when you stop reacting the way they expected you to. When the energy that once chased, explained, reassured, and tried to hold the connection together slowly becomes calm, steady, and strangely unbothered. For a long time, the connection may have followed a familiar pattern. You cared deeply. You tried to understand their distance. When they pulled away, you felt the silence and naturally wanted to close the gap. You asked questions. You tried to repair the space between you. And even if they didn't openly admit it, that pattern created a sense of predictability for them. They knew that if they stepped back, you would eventually step forward. If they became quiet, you would eventually try to reach them. But something subtle happens when that pattern stops. When the emotional chasing disappears, it creates a silence that feels different, not the painful silence filled with anxiety or waiting, not the silence where you are hoping they notice your absence. It is a different kind of quiet, a calm kind of quiet. The kind that comes from someone who has stopped trying to force the connection to move in a certain direction. And strangely, that quiet often does something unexpected inside the avoidant mind. Because when you appear truly unbothered, it interrupts a dynamic they had quietly grown used to. Avoidant personalities are not always comfortable with emotional intensity, but they often understand the rhythm of it. When someone reacts strongly, when someone seeks reassurance, when someone tries to talk things through again and again, it creates a familiar emotional environment. Even if they withdraw from it, they still understand the pattern, they know where they stand inside it. But calm indifference, or what appears to be indifference, feels different. When the emotional reactions stop, something inside them starts paying attention in a new way. The silence no longer feels like something they can easily categorize. Instead of feeling relieved by the absence of pressure, a quiet question begins forming in the background of their mind. Why are you suddenly okay without them? This question rarely appears immediately. Avoidants are often skilled at maintaining emotional distance, and their first response to your calm energy might simply be to continue doing what they were already doing. They may assume nothing has changed. They may believe you are simply taking a break before eventually returning to the same emotional rhythm. But over time, subtle details begin to stand out. The messages that once carried urgency are gone. The emotional explanations that once filled conversations are no longer there. The attempts to pull them closer, to clarify the relationship, to fix the distance, they quietly disappear. And this is where the psychological shift begins, because the absence of your reaction removes something they had unconsciously depended on. It removes the reassurance that they still had an emotional effect on you. For many avoidant individuals, emotional closeness can feel overwhelming, but emotional influence often still matters to them more than they openly admit. Knowing that their actions create a response can give them a sense of control over the emotional space between you. They may not consciously think of it that way, but the dynamic forms over time. If they step back and you step forward, it confirms something to them. It tells them that the connection still exists in a way they can predict. But when you remain calm, when you stop reacting, when your energy becomes steady and self-contained, that confirmation disappears. And without it, a strange kind of curiosity begins to grow. At first, it may only show up as small thoughts they push away quickly. Maybe they notice that the conversation patterns have changed. Maybe they realize you are not asking the questions you once asked. Maybe they scroll past something that reminds them of you and pause longer than usual. None of these moments look dramatic from the outside, but internally they create small disruptions in the emotional distance they once felt comfortable maintaining. Because suddenly, they are no longer completely sure how you feel. And uncertainty has a powerful psychological effect. When someone reacts strongly, the emotional message is clear. Whether it is anger, sadness, or longing, the meaning is visible. But when someone becomes calm and emotionally grounded, the message becomes harder to interpret. Are you still hurt? Did you move on? Do you still care? Or are you simply choosing not to show it anymore? For someone who relies on emotional distance as a way of protecting themselves, this kind of ambiguity can quietly pull their attention back toward the connection they once avoided, thinking about too deeply. It does not mean they immediately reach out. Avoidants often process things slowly and internally, but the mental space they had once created between themselves and the relationship starts feeling less stable. Because now, something has changed that they did not expect. For a long time, they may have believed that emotional distance gave them control over the pace and intensity of the connection. If things became overwhelming, they could step back. If they wanted closeness again, they could move forward gradually. But when your emotional energy becomes calm and independent, that sense of control begins to fade. And that realization can feel surprisingly uncomfortable, not because they suddenly want intense closeness, but because the emotional dynamic they understood no longer behaves the way they predicted. When you stop chasing, the connection becomes unpredictable to them, and unpredictability creates curiosity. This curiosity often starts quietly. They might begin paying attention to details they once ignored. They may notice how you carry yourself differently. They may observe that your conversations feel more relaxed, more neutral, less emotionally charged. Where there was once urgency, there is now composure. And composure can be strangely disarming. Because avoidant individuals often expect emotional reactions that match their fears about intimacy, they expect closeness to eventually turn into pressure. They expect caring to eventually turn into demands. They expect attachment to eventually become overwhelming. But when someone they once distanced themselves from becomes emotionally steady instead of reactive, it challenges those expectations in a subtle but powerful way. Your calmness becomes difficult to categorize, and the mind does not like unanswered questions. So little by little, they begin thinking about you in ways they didn't before. Not necessarily with intense longing at first, but with growing awareness, they may replay moments from the past, wondering if they misunderstood something. They may start noticing the absence of your emotional energy in their daily life. They may even feel a small sense of disorientation when they realize that the emotional dynamic has shifted without them consciously deciding to change it. But one of the most interesting parts of this process is that the avoidant person rarely talks about it openly. Instead, much of it happens quietly inside their own thoughts. They may observe from a distance. They may check in indirectly through small interactions. They may watch how you respond to different situations, now that the emotional tension has faded. And what they are often looking for, without even fully realizing it, is confirmation. Confirmation that the connection still exists somewhere beneath the calm surface, but your unbothered energy makes that confirmation difficult to find. You are not ignoring them, you are not pushing them away, but you are also not trying to pull them closer anymore. And this creates a new emotional space between you, a space where they must decide on their own whether the connection matters enough to step into that space again. For many avoidants, this is the moment where internal conflict begins. Part of them may still prefer the safety of distance. Emotional closeness still feels complicated, vulnerability still feels risky, but another part of them becomes increasingly aware that something important may be slipping quietly out of reach. And that awareness can feel surprisingly unsettling, because the calmness they once thought they wanted now comes with a new possibility. The possibility that you might actually be okay without them. And when that thought appears, it has a way of lingering longer than they expected. They may try to dismiss it at first. They may tell themselves that the connection was never that significant. They may remind themselves of the reasons they created distance in the first place, but the mind does not easily ignore unfinished emotional stories, especially when the ending suddenly becomes uncertain. Your unbothered presence changes the emotional atmosphere of the relationship in a way that words never could. It removes pressure, but it also removes predictability. It creates peace, but it also creates mystery. And for someone who once believed they understood exactly how the dynamic worked, that mystery becomes something they cannot easily stop thinking about, because now the connection exists in a completely different form. Not as something being chased, not as something being forced, but as something quietly standing on its own, waiting to see who will move next. And that quiet space where nothing is being forced, where nothing is being chased, often becomes the place where the avoidant mind begins doing something it rarely allows itself to do. It begins to reflect. For a long time, the distance between you may have allowed them to avoid looking too closely at the emotional meaning of the connection. When someone is constantly trying to close the gap, it can feel easier for an avoidant person to focus on the pressure rather than the feelings underneath it. The mind naturally labels the situation as overwhelming, complicated, or demanding, and once that label exists, it becomes the justification for stepping away again and again. But when your energy becomes calm and emotionally grounded, that narrative becomes harder for them to maintain because the pressure is gone. The urgency that once allowed them to explain their distance is no longer there. The emotional intensity that once gave them a reason to retreat has faded into something quiet and balanced. And in that silence, something unexpected happens. They begin noticing the emotional space you left behind, not the dramatic parts of the relationship, not the conflicts or misunderstandings that may have happened before, but the subtle emotional presence that once existed when you were close. They start remembering how safe certain conversations felt, how easy it was to be understood without needing to explain every thought, how there were moments when their guard lowered naturally without them even realizing it. These memories do not appear all at once. They surface slowly, sometimes triggered by small and ordinary things. A quiet evening where the absence of familiar communication feels slightly noticeable. A moment when something good happens and they briefly think about the person they once shared things with. A passing thought about a conversation that once brought comfort. At first, these reflections may feel easy to dismiss. Avoidant individuals are used to pushing emotional thoughts aside when they become too personal. They might tell themselves that the connection simply ran its course, that people move on, that distance was necessary. But the more they observe your calm independence, the more difficult it becomes to fully detach from the questions forming beneath those thoughts. Because your unbothered presence sends a message they are not entirely prepared to process. It suggests that you are no longer trying to pull them into something they feared. And that changes everything. For someone who once felt emotionally overwhelmed, the absence of pressure can create an entirely new perspective on the connection. Suddenly, the relationship no longer appears as something that demands constant emotional negotiation. Instead, it begins to look like something that once had quiet value, something that might have been safer than they originally believed. This realization often brings with it a subtle form of curiosity, not the dramatic kind that pushes someone to immediately act, but the slow and thoughtful kind that grows through observation. They may start paying closer attention to the way you carry yourself now. They may notice that your emotional energy feels lighter, that you are no longer trying to explain your feelings or seek reassurance from them, that conversations, when they happen, feel relaxed rather than emotionally loaded, and this calmness can feel strangely unsettling. Because many avoidants are deeply familiar with emotional intensity in relationships. They know how to respond to pressure by creating space. They know how to retreat when closeness begins to feel overwhelming. But they are often less prepared for someone who remains emotionally steady without demanding anything in return. Your calmness removes the conflict they once used to justify distance, and without that conflict, the emotional narrative they created about the connection begins to lose its clarity. This is often the stage where their internal conflict becomes stronger. Part of them appreciates the quiet freedom that distance provides. Avoidants often value independence deeply, and the idea of stepping back into emotional closeness can still feel intimidating. But another part of them begins to feel something else emerging quietly beneath the surface. A growing awareness that something meaningful might have been left unresolved. This awareness can appear in small, almost invisible ways. They may begin thinking about conversations they once avoided finishing, moments when you tried to explain how you felt and they responded with silence or withdrawal, situations where they pulled away not because they stopped caring, but because they didn't know how to handle the intensity of what was happening. Your unbothered energy creates space for those memories to return without the defensive reactions that once accompanied them. And that space allows reflection to deepen because now, when they think about those moments, the emotional environment around them feels different. There is no immediate pressure to respond, no expectation that they must fix something right away, Just the quiet recognition that the connection once held more meaning than they allowed themselves to fully acknowledge. For some avoidants, this realization can feel uncomfortable. It brings attention to emotions they spent a long time avoiding, feelings that once felt easier to keep hidden behind distance and silence, but now those feelings begin surfacing slowly, carried by the calm atmosphere you created by stepping back emotionally. And the more they observe your independence, the more another thought begins forming in the background. What if you have truly moved forward? This question carries a different kind of emotional weight, because while avoidants may struggle with closeness, they are not immune to the fear of losing something important. In fact, many avoidants carry a quiet sensitivity to rejection or abandonment, even if they rarely admit it openly. When you appear unaffected by their distance, it introduces the possibility that the connection no longer revolves around them. That possibility can feel strangely disorienting. For a long time, they may have believed that the emotional dynamic would remain unchanged, that if they stepped away, you would eventually return to the same pattern of trying to repair the distance, that the connection would always exist in a space where they could control how close or how far things became. But your calm detachment removes that certainty, and without certainty, the mind begins searching for answers. They might begin observing subtle signals that reveal whether your life has truly shifted. They may wonder if someone else has entered your world. They may notice changes in your tone, your confidence, your emotional boundaries, and every small detail becomes part of a quiet internal investigation. Not because they suddenly want to rush back into the relationship, but because the emotional story between you no longer feels finished. One of the most powerful aspects of this stage is that your silence often communicates more than words ever could. When someone repeatedly explains their feelings, those explanations can sometimes lose their impact over time. The other person may grow accustomed to hearing the same concerns or reassurances. The emotional message becomes predictable. But when someone who once spoke openly becomes calm and emotionally self-contained, the message becomes harder to ignore. Your actions begin telling a story they cannot easily interpret. You are not chasing. You are not demanding. You are simply existing in your own emotional balance, and that balance quietly challenges the assumptions they once had about you. Because now, instead of reacting to them, you are responding to your own sense of peace. For avoidant individuals, this shift can create a moment of unexpected vulnerability. Not the kind that shows itself dramatically, but the kind that exists in private thoughts late at night. The kind that appears when they realize they are thinking about you more often than they expected. They may start wondering whether they misunderstood your strength before, whether your patience was something they took for granted, whether the emotional safety they once felt around you was something rare that they failed to fully appreciate. These thoughts do not always lead to immediate action. Avoidants are cautious when it comes to emotional decisions. Even when curiosity grows stronger, they often hesitate before moving closer again. The fear of repeating old patterns or facing unresolved emotions can make them pause for long periods of time. But internally, something has already changed. The distance they once relied on as protection now feels less certain, because your unbothered presence has transformed the dynamic between you into something unfamiliar. A connection that no longer revolves around emotional pursuit, a connection that exists quietly in the background of their mind, waiting to see whether they will eventually choose to step toward it or watch it slowly fade into memory. And when a connection reaches that quiet point where nothing is being forced and nothing is being chased, something else begins to happen deep within the avoidant mind, something that most people never see because it rarely shows itself through obvious actions at first. Your calmness starts acting like a mirror, not a mirror that reflects your emotions, but one that slowly reflects their own behavior back to them. For a long time, the emotional dynamic may have allowed them to focus mainly on your reactions. When someone is constantly expressing their feelings, seeking reassurance, or trying to repair the connection, it becomes easy for an avoidant person to see the situation through that lens. The focus remains on the emotional intensity coming toward them, but once that intensity disappears, once the reactions soften and the chasing stops, the focus has nowhere else to go except inward. And that is when the reflection begins. They begin noticing the patterns that once felt normal to them, the moments when they pulled away instead of opening up, the conversations where they avoided vulnerability by changing the subject or becoming distant. The times when someone cared deeply about the connection, but they responded with silence because closeness felt too complicated to navigate. This kind of reflection is rarely comfortable. Avoidant personalities are not incapable of self-awareness, but they often learn early in life to protect themselves by minimizing emotional vulnerability. It becomes easier to keep relationships at a distance than to examine the fears that distance might be hiding. But your unbothered presence removes the distraction that once kept those deeper thoughts away. Because now the emotional energy that used to move toward them has become still, and in that stillness, they start seeing things differently. They may begin realizing that some of the distance they created had very little to do with the other person and much more to do with their own fear of emotional exposure. They may notice that moments when they felt overwhelmed were often the exact moments when the connection was becoming more meaningful. And that realization can feel unsettling. Not because they suddenly want to confront every emotion they once avoided, but because it introduces the possibility that they may have misunderstood the relationship while they were inside it. The calm energy you now carry quietly brings attention to that possibility. It suggests that perhaps the connection did not end because it was too intense or too demanding. Perhaps it ended because emotional closeness requires a level of openness they were not ready to offer at the time. This thought does not always arrive in a clear or organized way. It appears gradually, sometimes through random memories that return when they least expect them. A conversation where you were patient even when they withdrew. A moment when you tried to understand them rather than criticize them. A situation where your emotional honesty was met with silence simply because they did not know how to respond. When these memories resurface, they often carry a new emotional meaning because now there is distance between them and the situation. Distance allows perspective, and perspective can change how the entire story looks in hindsight. At the same time, another quiet shift begins forming inside them. They start noticing the difference between the emotional presence you once brought into their life and the emotional space that exists now. When someone has been part of your daily thoughts for a long time, their absence creates a subtle change in the atmosphere of your life. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is simply the absence of familiar warmth, the absence of someone who understood certain parts of you without needing long explanations. Avoidants often tell themselves that emotional independence means they do not rely on anyone, but even the most independent individuals notice when a certain emotional energy disappears from their world. And when they notice that absence, another question begins forming quietly in their mind. What if that connection was more meaningful than they allowed themselves to admit? This question can stay with them longer than they expected, because once the idea enters their thoughts, it begins influencing how they look at the past. Moments they once dismissed start appearing differently. Situations they once blamed entirely on emotional pressure begin showing shades of complexity they did not see before. And slowly, the emotional walls they once relied on start feeling less certain. Not because they suddenly collapse, but because the avoidant person begins realizing that those walls may have protected them from vulnerability while also blocking something valuable. This is often the stage where a quiet fear appears, a fear that the opportunity to reconnect might already be fading. Because while they have been slowly processing these reflections internally, your life has continued moving forward. Your calm independence signals something powerful to them. It signals that your world no longer revolves around trying to understand their distance. You are not waiting for them to change. You are not trying to convince them of your value. You are simply living in a way that feels emotionally balanced. And this realization can stir a very specific kind of discomfort inside someone who once relied on distance. The discomfort of wondering whether they waited too long. Because when someone stops chasing, it often means they have reached a deeper level of emotional acceptance. They are no longer fighting for the connection in the same way. They have made peace with the possibility that life may continue without it. And when an avoidant person senses that shift, it can create an internal tension they struggle to ignore. Part of them may still hesitate to step forward. The fear of vulnerability does not disappear overnight. But another part of them begins recognizing that the connection might not always remain available in the background. That realization introduces something they rarely allow themselves to feel fully. The fear of being forgotten. Avoidants often hide this fear beneath layers of independence and emotional control. They may appear completely comfortable with distance, but deep down, many of them carry the same human need to feel remembered, valued, and significant in someone else's life. When your energy becomes unbothered, it quietly challenges that sense of significance, not in a cruel way, but in a natural one. Your calmness suggests that your happiness does not depend on their presence anymore, and that thought can stay with them longer than they expected. Because once they begin imagining a future where you are truly content without them, something inside them starts questioning whether the distance they created was worth the outcome. They may start wondering what it would feel like to reconnect in a different way, to approach the connection with more awareness than before, to see whether the emotional bond that once existed could still be there beneath the quiet surface. But even as these thoughts appear, hesitation often remains. Avoidants tend to observe before they act. They watch carefully, trying to understand whether the emotional door is still open before they risk stepping toward it again. This observation phase can last longer than most people realize. They may pay attention to small interactions, small signals, small shifts in your energy, looking for any sign that the connection still holds meaning for you. But your unbothered presence does something powerful during this time. It keeps the emotional atmosphere calm and pressure-free, and that calmness allows them to continue reflecting without feeling cornered or forced into a decision they are not ready to make. Because the truth is, real emotional shifts inside avoidant individuals rarely happen through pressure. They happen through quiet realization, through moments where distance allows them to see what closeness once meant, through the slow understanding that some connections carry a depth they did not fully appreciate while they were inside them. And when that understanding begins forming, the emotional dynamic between you changes in a way that neither silence nor distance can completely erase. Because now the connection exists not just as a memory of the past, but as a possibility they quietly wonder about in the present. And when a connection reaches that point, when it exists quietly as a possibility rather than an active pursuit, something deeper begins unfolding inside the avoidant mind, something that is often invisible to everyone else. Because once the questions begin, they rarely disappear easily. The human mind has a natural tendency to revisit unfinished emotional experiences. When a relationship ends with loud conflict or clear closure, the story may feel complete even if it was painful. But when something fades quietly, when there was meaning, connection, and emotional depth that never fully reached its natural conclusion, the mind tends to return to it again and again. And that is exactly what your unbothered energy creates. It leaves the story open. You did not force the ending. You did not close the door with anger or resentment. Instead, you stepped back emotionally and allowed the connection to exist without pressure. And that kind of ending often lingers longer in someone's thoughts than dramatic separation ever could. Because now they are left with their own reflections, left with the quiet realization that the emotional dynamic changed not because you stopped caring, but because you stopped forcing something that required mutual effort. This realization slowly removes the emotional shield they once used to justify distance. When the connection felt intense, it was easy for them to tell themselves that space was necessary. When conversations carried emotional weight, it was easy to believe that stepping back was the safest option. But now the emotional landscape looks different. You are calm, you are steady. You are no longer asking for explanations or reassurance, and that change forces them to confront a question they may have avoided for a long time. What if closeness was never the real problem? What if the real challenge was their own fear of being fully seen? This thought can be deeply uncomfortable for someone who has spent years protecting themselves from vulnerability. Avoidants often build their emotional independence as a form of safety. They learn to rely on themselves, to keep relationships balanced at a distance where emotional exposure feels manageable. But when they encounter someone who once offered genuine emotional connection without manipulation or control, that experience leaves a lasting imprint. Even if they pulled away from it, even if they convinced themselves they were better off alone, the memory of that emotional safety remains somewhere beneath the surface. And when your energy becomes calm rather than reactive, it allows them to revisit that memory without feeling overwhelmed. They start remembering how certain moments with you felt different from other connections, how conversations sometimes flowed naturally without the need for emotional defenses, how there were moments when they almost allowed themselves to relax into closeness before fear quietly pulled them back again. These memories begin forming a quiet contrast in their mind, a contrast between the distance they created and the emotional warmth they once experienced. And in that contrast, something surprising can happen. They begin missing your energy. Not necessarily the emotional intensity that once existed, but the presence itself, the feeling of being understood without constant explanation, the emotional patience that allowed them to be themselves even when they struggled to express what they felt. Absence has a unique way of revealing value. When someone is consistently present in your life, their emotional energy can become something you take for granted without realizing it. But once that energy disappears, the difference becomes noticeable in subtle but meaningful ways. For avoidance, this recognition can arrive slowly. At first, it may appear as simple nostalgia, a quiet thought about a moment that once felt meaningful, a memory that returns unexpectedly during a quiet evening. But as time passes, those thoughts begin connecting into something larger, a growing awareness that the connection they once stepped away from may have carried a depth they did not fully appreciate at the time. And that awareness can bring with it a feeling they rarely like to face. Regret, not always dramatic regret, not the kind that immediately leads to grand gestures or emotional confessions, but the quiet kind that appears in private moments of honesty. The kind that whispers a difficult question. What if things could have been different? What if they had responded with openness instead of distance? What if they had allowed themselves to explore the connection rather than protecting themselves from it? These questions do not always lead to immediate action, but they create an emotional shift that is difficult to reverse. Because once someone begins imagining an alternate version of the past, they also begin wondering whether the future might still hold a chance to explore what was left unfinished. And this is where the dynamic changes in a profound way. For a long time, the connection may have existed in a pattern where you carried most of the emotional effort. You were the one trying to understand, the one trying to communicate, the one trying to hold the connection together while they moved in and out of distance. But once your energy becomes unbothered, that pattern dissolves. Now the emotional movement must come from them if the connection is going to exist again. And this realization can feel both intimidating and strangely motivating. Because for perhaps the first time, they begin seeing the relationship not as something they must escape from, but as something they might have to step toward intentionally. This requires a level of emotional courage they may not have practiced often in the past. It means acknowledging feelings they once ignored. It means admitting that their distance may have contributed to the loss of something meaningful. It means accepting that reconnecting would require vulnerability instead of avoidance. For some avoidants, this realization becomes the turning point that leads them to slowly move closer again. Not with dramatic declarations, but with small and careful steps. A message that appears after a long silence. A conversation that feels more thoughtful than before. A curiosity about your life that seems deeper than casual interest. These small gestures often represent a much larger internal journey that took place quietly before they ever reached out. But even if they never take those steps, even if their hesitation ultimately keeps them at a distance, the emotional impact of your unbothered presence still changes something important within them. It changes how they understand the connection. Because instead of remembering it as something overwhelming or complicated, they begin remembering it as something calm, something genuine, something that once offered emotional safety they did not fully recognize at the time. And that memory stays with them, sometimes for a long time. Meanwhile, your own journey continues forward in a different direction. The calmness that once confused them becomes the foundation of your emotional freedom. You are no longer caught in the exhausting cycle of trying to earn someone's closeness. You are no longer measuring your worth through someone else's ability to stay present. You have stepped into a space where your peace does not depend on anyone else's emotional readiness. And that is the quiet power of unbothered energy. It does not chase, it does not beg, it simply exists with confidence and self-respect. Ironically, that is often the very energy that avoidants find hardest to ignore because it removes the emotional pressure they once feared while also removing the certainty that you will always be there waiting. And in that balance between peace and mystery, between independence and quiet emotional depth, the connection transforms into something entirely different from what it once was. Not a pursuit, not a struggle, but a silent crossroads where two people must decide on their own whether they are ready to meet each other in a new and more honest way.